Hey everyone, I'm Samit Sarkar. Welcome to Polygon Friends List, the podcast where we talk with our friends about video games. My best friend, I don't know if the same thing works for you guys, but my best friend is my boss. His name is Chris Grant. He's with us here today. How's it going, Chris?
It's going well. Does being a best friend mean that I have to reciprocate BFF status, or can it be one way? I'm not sure
I
about
think
that.
in this case, since you're my boss, it's okay if it's a one-way thing.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. So, Chris, you're here to talk with us about a big event in the video game industry, E-Triple or E3. I think the Electronic Entertainment Expo is what it stands for. Are you sure about how that works?
We were discussing this before the show, whether or not it's like KFC and it's just E3 now. I think it still is the Electronic Entertainment Expo. That's weird because it's like electronic entertainment. It seems so anachronistic. But sure, E3 is coming up in less than a month in June out in Los Angeles. I know. Ugh. And I guess we're here to discuss the hype or, kind of pre-hype cycle of E3 and how effective that is.
Yeah,
Which is to say, yeah, why are we announcing so many games before E3?
right. I should, I guess, say that we're not actually talking about E3 itself. We're technically talking about the weeks leading up to E3 because it seems like more and more publishers are making big announcements before the big show. We're seeing a lot of that over the past couple of weeks. We've had big announcements like just yesterday, Ubisoft announced Far Cry 4. Early this morning, Microsoft announced the official title of Halo 5, the fifth Halo game.
And general release date, they said 2015.
Right, fall of 2015.
Yeah. So, I mean, even right there, right? Like those would be two of the bigger announcements at E3. Far Cry 4 was announced very unceremoniously in a Ubisoft financial report. So, like, that's like an interesting place to do that. Followed up by a PlayStation blog post and a Ubi blog post and whatever. And then Halo was announced this morning with like a piece of key art and a general release date and a title. It just seems like E3 used to be the place where all that stuff is saved up for. And the question is why they're kind of getting out in front of it now, even if it's just a name reveal and gameplay is saved for E3. And if you ask me, I think it has a lot to do with the general media landscape today that these companies find themselves in. You make a game like Halo 5, it's going to be 3 years after Halo 4. Big investment, a whole new studio to build it, and they need to make sure it's a hit. They need to make sure that they get the kind of, maximum exposure they have. They also have fewer hits. They're not making Halo games every year. And this is kind of true generally across the industry that each of these big AAA games is more expensive to build. It has to be a bigger hit. And you can't just focus solely on, a single one-day E3 reveal at the busiest gaming news event of the year, the busiest gaming news week of the year. Your chances of getting buried alive are substantially higher. So you're seeing these companies sort of try and get out a little ahead of it. So if they can get a little bit of attention, a little bit of mind share, to use what I'm sure is a marketing term that showed up on some PowerPoint somewhere with regards to this strategy, that they would view that as a success. I think for a lot of us, we look at something like Far Cry 4 being announced with a, like, let's be honest, not super great piece of key art with like the weird guy in the purple suit, like holding a guy's head, in a financial report. And it's like, it's underwhelming. It doesn't read as confidence. It reads as opportunistic.
So
But, what they're trying to do is get some of that attention before it gets buried under the weight of E3.
it's interesting you mentioned the sales success, the pressure that's on these games, and I get the idea of getting out ahead of time for something big like Halo 5 Guardians. But Far Cry 4, they announced yesterday, is coming out in November, I think November 18th in North America. And so that seems like a pretty strange thing for Ubisoft to do, to announce the game 6 months before it's being released. I mean, announced officially that it had leaked earlier that it was going to be a game set in the Himalayas. But we certainly didn't know that the main antagonist was going to be a combination of Anderson Cooper and Julian Assange. Now we do. We've got the key art, and we've got some more details on it. But certainly the way they announced it was strange. But is it also strange to you that they hadn't talked about it previously officially?
I think like the specific Far Cry example is curious. Ubisoft had its earnings call right after that announcement, so they got it in right under the wire there. Was that related? Like, probably. They probably wanted to be able to tell investors and shareholders and analysts that they had this product, right, to give them a bit of a positive spin. And there are different horse races happening in gaming. One of them is a quarterly investors call where you have to convince the actual people who run your company in a way, that you have products that people are going to want. The other horse race, though, is E3. And I think like one of the risks you run if you're one of these companies is you want to be able to get to E3 and win that horse race. It's one of the few opportunities for all sorts of reasons that the mainstream media pays attention to gaming year round. And so if you effectively bow out of that race by pre-announcing everything ahead of time and getting rid of a lot of your buzz, you have a hard time really building enthusiasm at the show. And then when the mainstream media comes knocking and wants to know who won E3, which I think despite its maybe reduced importance in the world of video games, that is still a question that we get when we're there every, 8 seconds. Mm-hmm. And last year, it was very clear who won. Everyone knew who won. They knew who won the second after the press conference was over, and that was Sony. And so I think like the more you pre-reveal or pre-announce things, the kind of more blunted the impact of it at the show is going to be. When they show off, I'm going to guess, first in-engine gameplay footage of Halo 5, and it's going to look amazing, but it won't come out till next year, and no, you can't play it, and no, we don't have any more footage. Is that going to be that exciting? Like, I don't think so. And this brings up the company who's deviated the most from this strategy, and we've talked about this on Friends List before, is Nintendo. Mm-hmm. Who they're not necessarily pre-announcing stuff, but they certainly are bowing out of the kind of E3 reveal cycle, by not doing a press conference and they're doing their own live coverage from the show floor. Which sort of again reinforces this idea that like the media landscape has changed, and these companies have to change the way that they just discuss their products, talk about their products, get their products to their audience, whether that's at the show, but in the case of today's topic, specifically before the show. And it's tough. I think the big takeaway for me is like none of these companies actually have the answer. That this is all experimental. This is all an attempt to like try something, knowing that they don't have a lot of great options. You can get the cover, if you have a reveal, get the cover of Game Informer. They've got about 11 of those a year, so good luck getting that. You can go on stage at E3. Ubisoft has its own press conference, so that's why it's a little strange here. Seems like they would do that. Maybe that means they have a lot of other games. Maybe it means Ubisoft has so many games that they just want to be able to get Far Cry out a little bit ahead of time so they don't have to spend so much time on it during the show. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder if it's not necessarily indicative of any particular trend, but it is sort of a case-by-case basis, for these different games and these different publishers. You look at Far Cry 4, and what that screamed to me was not only just getting it out for the investors, but specifically because during that same investor call, they announced that the Division was being delayed into 2015. So, you have to kind of blunt the disappointment of that announcement with some positive news, like, hey, we're not going to have this huge game for 2014, but we will have this other huge game that we hope will be one of the top 10 best-selling games of the year. That's what they said in their presentation.
For Far Cry 4, which, I mean, I like Far Cry games a lot, but that still sounds ambitious.
Certainly.
And I think with the Division, that's another interesting example of pre-hype. Like, I mean, obviously they had to tell their investors, but like getting that out of the way now, so we don't go to E3 and find out there that the Division's delayed and get disappointed, and sort of like a demerit in Ubisoft's scorecard. And instead, it's like, okay, so now we go into E3 knowing that the Division is 2015, which I'm surprised. Like I had no illusions that that was coming out this year
Yeah.
anyway, because, but like that's another example of trying to head off criticism or head off disappointment by just coming right out and saying, "Look, that's not coming out this year." I'm sure we'll see more of it at E3. It was certainly one of the games that was most impressive last year, and I'm sure they've got more to show us this year. But yeah, some of that definitely does get caught up in the financial cycle, specific for Ubisoft in this case, where they had to get some of that out of the gate first.
Now, you talked about this a little bit before, but with all these announcements coming before, what is traditionally the big show, E3, do you run the risk, as Lick Chan on Twitter points out, of really just ruining the sort of hype cycle, of ruining the excitement that particularly hardcore gamers have for E3? I mean, you have all these announcements going out beforehand. Now, what are people supposed to expect from the show itself?
I think you hit the nail on the head there with a specific term there, hardcore gamers. I think for hardcore gamers, I would count myself amongst that group. I can't help but think it's disappointing. Like, E3 is Christmas for a week. You get new game reveals. You get first looks at games. Like, it's this very exciting period. And, as we have fewer and fewer major AAA investments, and a bigger and bigger demand for hits, which leads to some risk-averse development trends, I think you're already seeing something where E3 isn't as exciting, right? There's a new Batman game this year. Yeah, I mean, of course. New Assassin's Creed game this year. Of course. New Call of Duty, of course. Even new Halo, which, even that's not even every year. It's every 3 years now. But like, even that's, of course, that's going to be there. So I think in some ways, like, E3 has become less exciting because of that trend in and of itself. And then I think on top of that, you have this kind of pre-announced cycle. So like what little surprise there was is now being pre-announced and sort of eroded out. And so I think for the hardcore gamer, they're absolutely going to be more disappointed. But I think also with these kind of AAA blockbuster hits, a lot of their audience aren't hardcore gamers, right? There's a very large mainstream audience out there for these massive games. And so they really need to find that audience. And that audience can be hard to find. So trying to get out ahead of that noise, I think is really smart for that broader audience. But I think it certainly does run the risk of disappointing that hardcore audience.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that any of this is possibly due to these publishers wanting to get ahead of any possible leaks? I mean, you look at Ubisoft, the way they announced Assassin's Creed Unity, that was after a major leak from, I think, Kotaku. And then all of a sudden, they didn't go the usual PR route of, we're not going to comment. They just put out a trailer and said, hey, here it is.
Yep. And there was also Call of Duty, was scheduled to be unveiled, but they had to run a little early because of a leak. Yeah, I mean, I think companies that don't have a contingency plan for potentially leaks do themselves a big disservice, but I don't think necessarily getting out early is a strategy to obviate leaks. Like, the leaks are going to happen, and I think having a backup plan is smarter than the nuclear option of just like, well, let's just announce it now. And ultimately, like, the people who see the leaks are a small audience, right? The people who saw the leak for Call of Duty was a much smaller audience than the people who eventually saw the trailer that Activision released a couple hours later. So, I think again it gets into that distinction between hardcore and mainstream audience and gamers. I think it also gets into the validity of E3 as an idea in principle, which is 10 years ago, in the kind of infancy of the internet, the press served a really kind of pivotal and functional role in the kind of dissemination of information about these games. And now, when these companies have a lot of the same tools that we have, they have a lot of the same reach, or oftentimes greater reach than the press to reach that audience. Not to mention, obviously, things like advertising, et cetera. That what is the purpose of E3? It's this sort of exclusionary, isolated, in many ways, just like the name, anachronistic offline event for something that increasingly seems like it should be online and sort of direct marketing to their audience. Sort of like what Nintendo's doing. And I don't necessarily think Nintendo's strategy is good, but in a vacuum, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, that's where Nintendo's been going for a long time, though, right? I mean, they don't usually, or they haven't been playing into that sort of traditional marketing cycle in the sense of, they've been doing Nintendo Direct streams for a long time, and with those, they're speaking directly to their hardcore gamers. The stream is on their website, it's on Ustream, it's on YouTube, and that's the way they're disseminating their information to their most diehard fans.
So if we use that as a kind of case study, I think the risk there, they've been doing it since 2011. And if you look at Nintendo's success since 2011, I think you run the risk of talking to an already engaged audience, right? Preaching to the choir. Mm-hmm. And so at E3, the thing that E3 still does get you is that horse race. It still does get mainstream attention in a way that the rest of the year in gaming does not. The holidays get it a little bit, not even as much as you'd think, and E3 gets it. And so, major events happening in gaming, and our phones don't blow up. E3 comes around and every news outlet in the country is calling the video game press to ask who won. Like, that's a story. It's a beat that they hit every year. And Nintendo, I think, effectively is ducking out. And that does get a different kind of coverage. Being a game like The Division last year, where everyone wants to talk about it, or a couple years ago, Star Wars 1313 being like this early next-gen peak, having that kind of buzz is really hard to do online. It's noisy. And so E3 does have, that kind of exclusive nature of it does give you an opportunity to break off from that, and sort of, in a side-by-side horse race, come out on top. But, that's an awful big risk to take when, if you're Activision, for example. Mm-hmm. Activision has basically like 3 brands left that they care about: Call of Duty, Destiny, and Skylanders. That's it. Like, those 3 games need to be big hits. They're not announcing 10 games at E3. They're just focusing on these 3 major brands and really leaning into them. So they don't care. I mean, they in fact need to announce all those things ahead of time. We've seen most of those games before. But it's different for publishers that distribute a lot of other types of games, Ubisoft and Square Enix and even Microsoft and Sony. Sony has a lot of first-party studios. I expect to see a lot of games from them. Like the biggest weak point of the PS4 at launch was an absence of software, specifically first-party software. And so I think this year at E3, I'm expecting Sony's kind of massive investment in first-party studios to really be a strength. And they have not, to their credit, felt any need to announce these games early, right? We know Uncharted 4, I guess, was announced early and with basically just a teaser trailer. That's it. There's Last of Us Remastered, but re-release. Then there's been rumors of this Project Beast game, a kind of Demon Souls sequel.
They'll have The Order certainly as well there.
Yeah, The Order will be there, which was announced last year, but not really shown outside of a trailer. So I think there's still going to be a ton of surprises in stock, and it really depends on how that company or that publisher is investing in development. Yeah. Sony's got a lot of studios. Activision has a lot of big brands. And so those are 2 much different strategies. And it also really kind of impacts with how they're going to come out looking at E3. I don't think Activision imagines it's going to be best of show, right, as a publisher. Like, that's not the game that they're in. But it doesn't matter when all of Activision's games are going to sell ridiculously anyway. But seriously, Project Beast, I want to see more about it.
Yeah. I want to wrap this up with to touch on something you mentioned earlier. And, this has kind of been a bit of a doom and gloom here. But I feel like one potentially positive aspect of early announcements is getting them out of the way so you can focus on what people really want to talk about at E3. So I'm thinking specifically of Microsoft with their latest Xbox 180 this week, where they announced that they'll be selling the console without a Kinect for $399 as of, I think, June 9th. And that's generally something you would think would be revealed on stage at E3. Same thing with the Xbox Live announcements, where they're taking the apps down from the gold paywall. And yet, to me, and I don't know if you agree, to me that signals that Microsoft is ready to just talk about games at E3. I mean, hopefully that's the case. Maybe they're also going to bring in, Steven Spielberg and talk about Xbox originals, but who knows?
Yeah, I'm going to imagine that they're going to talk about more than just games. I think in those two cases, those were both embarrassing, reversals for the Xbox Live app paywall. They had the dubious distinction of being the only console, or really the only TV connected set-top box that needed a separate paywall to access Netflix, which is on my phone. It's built into my TV. It's on my, that was kind of an insane requirement. So pulling that down, I think, was long overdue. But that wasn't something they wanted to get accolades for on stage, because what they would have gotten instead are jokes, right? Like, it was a laughable policy to have anyway in 2014. And then the Kinect was the same way. That's a big reversal. Like, get that reversal out of the way and don't focus on it, and just pretend like it, never happened, and like move on, or pretend like the original policy never happened. Doing it on stage at E3 draws attention to the miscalculation in the first place. So don't do that. So they're getting some of their more embarrassing kind of gaffes out of the way. And I think in the process, really tightening up the product that they're offering with Xbox One, which maybe to its credit, based on fan feedback, looks a lot more like an Xbox 360 that's beefed up than the sort of, a lot of the promise that they made when they first unveiled it, with digital rights management back to the Xbox 360, which is put a disc in it, and now Kinect being back to Xbox 360, which is buy it separately or in a bundle.
Well, we'll certainly see in a few weeks either way. Chris, I want to thank you for coming on the show and chatting with me, and certainly I want to thank all of you for watching. You can subscribe to youtube.com/Polygon for more of this kind of stuff and all of our great video stuff. I guess everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.